Talk about something a little different, I guess. Talking about Reuben. Of course, Reuben was the oldest son of Jacob. I titled it Reuben, Israel's older brother. And I was thinking about when you look back in history, the odyssey of man, I guess, and all the things that happen and all the things that's been done, and you sometimes wonder, what does this mean and why does it happen this way? But anyway, in looking at this, to me it's interesting. I hope people find it interesting. We all know that Jacob had 12 sons. And in his old age, Joseph was born. He was born to Rachel, his favorite wife. Of course, he got kind of trouble with God because he favored Rachel so much over his other wife, but she was his favorite, and because of that, maybe because of his old age, Joseph was his favorite child, of course. And Joseph was blessed of God. And he had dreams of future greatness. And he wasn't shy about sharing those dreams, that some of the dreams he had dreamed, he would talk about them, how he'd see himself standing there and his brothers and even his mother and father would bow down to him. And that didn't go over too good with his brothers, at least. I guess his father didn't take it quite that way, but with the brothers, they didn't like that. And these dreams of future greatness didn't mean much to them. And when his brothers saw that their father loved Joseph more, of course, they hated him. And there was a time when, of course, they were shepherds, and they were in the field with the flocks, his brothers were, and Jacob became concerned about them, and he sent Joseph to find his brothers, see how they were doing, probably take them supplies and things like that. And of course, they saw him coming from afar off, it says, and they said, well, here comes that dreamer, the troublemaker, and they didn't like it too much. And they actually planned to kill him. And they were going to kill him, throw him in a cistern, and tell Jacob that, animals had killed him or something like that. But here's where Reuben comes in. Reuben, the eldest son, when he saw what they were going to do, he tried to rescue Joseph. He didn't want to kill him. He had enough sense about him. He knew that wasn't right to do. And we can read about that in Genesis 37. I guess we probably should look at it. Genesis 37 and 21. Of course, in 19, I'll pick it up there, they said, here comes that dreamer. They said to each other, come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Just throw him in a cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and to take him back to his father. So he planned, I guess, to rescue him later and return him to his father, but didn't work out that way. They didn't kill him, but they decided to, Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, not lay hands on him. After all, he is our brother and our own flesh and blood. And they agreed. So they sold him into slavery. And the part of Reuben being instrumental in rescuing him will be interesting. It was interesting, but it has a thread that runs further too. So they sold Joseph into Egypt and reported him dead. But Joseph became great in Egypt. Of course, eventually through famine, they all had to move there, and Jacob was able to see his son that he never thought he'd see again, thought was dead, and he was able to see his son. Not only his son, but he found out that he had 2 boys, so he had grandsons. He never thought to see Joseph, but here he got to see his sons. In Genesis 48, let's turn there. Genesis 48. Genesis 48 and 5. And here he's being introduced to his grandsons. He said, "Now then, your 2 sons born to you in Egypt before I came to you, here will be reckoned as mine." So he's up and adopting these sons. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Any children born to you after them will be yours. And the territory they inherit will be reckoned under the names of their brothers. So he adopted these boys. And a few verses over, well, we can go down to verse 15, I guess, and pick it up. He said, "May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name, Israel." He's naming his name, which was Israel, on these 2 grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And of course, he placed his right hand on the younger one's son, and it displeased Joseph. He tried to tell him no, but he said, "No, my father, this is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But the father refused and said, "I know, my son. He too shall become a people, and he too shall become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater." So here he sees his sons, his grandsons, and he blesses them, and they are to become a company of nations and a great nation. And of course, we've talked about this before, and when you look around in modern times, I've never been able to find any other people that are a company of great nations and a great nation, same ethnic people, the same God, the same everything as Great Britain and America. But how does Reuben fit into this? Well, Reuben should have been the one that got the birthright blessing. He was the oldest son, and that's normally what happened, just like with Isaac. Abraham gave him the birthright blessing. And then Isaac passed it on to Jacob. And you would have thought, well, it would go on to Reuben because he's the eldest. But let's turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 5. First Chronicles 5, verse 1. And it's talking about the lineage here of these different sons. And it's talking about Reuben. It said, "The sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel," which he was. "He was the firstborn, but when he defiled his father's marriage bed, his rights as firstborn were given to the sons of Joseph, sons of Israel. So he could not be listed in the genealogy in accordance with his birthright. And though Judah was the strongest of his brothers and the ruler came from him, the rights of the firstborn belonged to Joseph." And, of course, these 2 sons of his. And, of course, there is another interesting thing. The blessing was split at that point. The blessing of the scepter of the kings went to Judah, and the birthright blessing, the great wealth and power and everything went to Joseph, to his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. But again, what is Reuben in all this? You know, he's passed over. He didn't get the birthright. But we seen earlier where Reuben was very instrumental in saving the life of Joseph. Now, God could have done that anyway. He could have performed a miracle. He could have had anybody, but he didn't. Reuben did it. And I think that I just have to think in my mind that was an honor that was given to him by God. And during the war, well, let's go forward very much in time. We go forward to the 1700s when America was trying to win their independence from Great Britain, trying to become that great nation. During the War of Independence, a very decisive battle was fought at Yorktown, where General Washington forced the British General Cornwallis to surrender. But a major factor in that battle was a French naval victory, and Dr. Ricks was mentioning that was probably maybe the only great naval victory that France ever had over Great Britain. And what a key time! Without them defeating the British naval force and forcing them back, they could have came in there, resupplied Cornwallis with men, material. They could even use their guns as against George Washington's enemy. But it wasn't to be. And again, it was Reuben. It was France, but some scholars that have studied such things believe that believe that France was made up largely of the tribe of Reuben. And over the years, there's been a lot of interaction between France and Britain and America. France and Britain have fought wars. They've been allies in wars. It's back and forth. It's almost like a family feud at times. But here we see that, was Reuben coming, the big brother coming to the aid of Israel again. And a final thought, I guess, is when, during World War II, when the Allies when they invaded Europe and they were liberating France, and they were getting ready to march into Paris to liberate it from the Nazis. Well, at the forefront of the Allied forces was French troops. It was an honor, I guess, given to France and also respect. They had been defeated by the Germans. They had been occupied, but they resisted the whole time. They had resistance fighters the whole time. So it was respect and an honor that was given to them. And I think it was a very nice gesture. And to me, I find that interesting. I hope everyone did. Thank you.
Well, the title of this message is Idolatry, the number one threat. Idolatry, the number one sin. If you look at the Ten Commandments, the very first commandment is nothing before God. So why is idolatry, putting nothing before the true God, why is it the number one sin? Why? And I think understanding a little biblical history will help us. And it's always a threat. And I want to just, I know we talked about this last week a little bit, just want to say it again. God is so great that God cannot be limited to a physical picture, figurine, statuette, carving on a mountainside or in a coin, all the things that the world has, that you can't really picture God in such limited style. He's just too great. I'm going to read some sections from Isaiah just to give us, Isaiah is kind of describing it a little bit himself. Isaiah 40, verse 15. Isaiah 40:15 reads, "Behold, the nations are a drop in the bucket." I know that's an expression that's gotten common, but compared to God, even big nations like China, Russia, the United States are a drop in the bucket compared to God, and are counted as small dust. Not big dust, small dust. Look, he lifts up the islands as a very little thing, and Lebanon is not sufficient to burn. In other words, in those days, you had the famous cedars of Lebanon at a big forest. I think it's all been ruined now by the world of terrorism, but they weren't even worthy of fuel to be burned for God, nor its beasts sufficient for a burnt offering. All nations before him are as nothing, and they're counted to him less than nothing and worthless. You know, when David looked at the stars and he said, when I look at the heavens, and David could only see a part of what we now know, David said, what is man that you're mindful of him? Counted as less than nothing and worthless. Verse 18, to whom then will you liken God? What likeness will you compare to him? Even if you got a glimpse of God, you couldn't really draw a picture, even if you're a good artist or carver, to really encompass God. Nothing in our world, physical world, compares to God. God's in a whole new dimension. Not that we understand it, because we don't. We can't see it. We know from the Bible there could be an angelic army could be out in front of this building right now. We wouldn't see it unless God wanted us to see it. Isaiah 40, verse 19. The workman molds an image. The goldsmith overspreads it with gold. In other words, God makes a little mold and they put gold plating on it, or silversmith casts silver on it. Whoever is too impoverished for such a contribution chooses a tree that will not rot. He seeks himself a skillful workman. He carves an image on the tree. That's supposed to be God. And the pagans would carry these things around and worship them. And I'm not being critical. Some of our neighbors have little statues on their front porch to protect them. They're carved images. And they would say, at least pagans said in the past, well, this little carved statue reminds us of the God that's in the sky. But the truth is, idols block us from spiritually worshiping the true God. Isaiah 40:22, same area. It is he who sits above the circle of the earth. By the way, it's interesting that this is, I think that's 27 centuries ago. How did Isaiah know the world was round? Just a thought. There's some other scriptures in there, and Job, they talk about the sphere of the earth. There are other scriptures in there that defied scientific knowledge of its day. I'll put it that way. And its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretch out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. Verse 25 and 26. To whom then will you liken me, or to whom shall I be equal? Notice, says the Holy One. In a sense, we're like bugs compared to God. I mean, maybe that's a bad analogy, but that's the Bible analogy, grasshoppers. And there's nothing that we could build, a statue, carving, no matter how well we did it, plate it with gold. There's nothing that'll be equal with God, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high. See who has created these things, and who brings out the host by number, calls them all by name. In other words, God names every star in heaven. And we don't really know for sure, but they have these telescopes that are out there. Once you get away from the Earth's atmosphere, they can see a whole lot more. They think Earth is strategically positioned. And one book, the one about the privileged planets, says they believe God put us in this position so we could see the greatness of the universe. We're in the right place. Our Milky Way is in the right place. Anyway, you have to kind of look at their chart to figure it out, but I think they're right. God put us so we could see the greatness of the heavens. And there's so many stars out there. Billions. And they can't see the end of it. And yet God says he can name every one. You're going to say, well, how is that possible? We don't have to worry about it. God may have naming schemes and numbers and schemes and combinations we can't even compare with. One thing, I was watching this video by several scientists, and they were talking about DNA sequencing. And basically, as the DNA in our body is a binary computer code. They actually figured it out in the 60s, but as the years go on, they're understanding it more. It controls your body. And there are a couple other mechanisms too, so it's even more complicated, but that's the main one. And at each DNA, there are at least 20 molecular combinations. And each one has to be perfect for your body to work the way it's supposed to work. Any genetic miscalculation, you get a bad genetic disease, or you just don't exist. It doesn't grow. Doesn't become what it is. And everything on this planet has the similar sequence. That includes whales, plants, all kinds of things. You never even think about it. And they said, well, evolution says it all happened by accident, by chance. And these guys, they had some mathematicians and scientists, and they were calculating the odds of it coming out correctly to be what you're supposed to be. And they said the number was so astronomical that it's unbelievable. And the guy one of the scientists said, he kind of choked. I hate to say it, like, there's got to be an intelligent designer. He was almost choked on the words because he knew that meant a theocracy, and science is against God because man doesn't need God. We're too smart for that. But they had to admit it. They know more about math and odds and statistics, but when you start seeing the numbers, they play little games about how getting it all straight, only 1 in 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, several million. How is that happening by accident? And also, to make it worse, when there is something goes wrong in a gene, it normally does not improve the species. It actually downgrades it. Usually it makes something go bad, or the thing just doesn't work and dies. Because you think, well, but don't genes, doesn't something bombard it and the gene comes up with something new? Well, the odds when it comes up something new, it's not going to work. It's going to go down, not up. And I know evolution says we're evolving higher and higher and greater and greater. Actually, that's not really true. And even, I'll just give you one example that I looked into many years ago. They took something like dogs, and they discovered that dogs who are in the wild live in a very cold climate will have thicker thicker fur. Actually, you know what the greatest thing is? The fur on a polar bear is unbelievable. It's hollow. That's why it looks white, but it's hollow, all the hairs. It is unbelievably good in holding in heat. I saw it in a science special, if I could describe it. That's why the polar bear can live in the Arctic. Most animals, during the Arctic winter, they have to go underground, they hibernate. But the polar bear can stay out there and hunt seals and do all that. It's a blizzard, and it's, minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But the polar bear was designed for it. I wish I could hear that description. But it's unbelievable how good his fur is. But getting back to the dogs. And the dogs who live in warmer climates don't have that. But what they discovered is that the original set of dogs had the genetic potential to adjust. In other words, it's in a part of its gene sequence with some adaptability. But if you take a dog where all the genes didn't survive, that didn't have the long, tough fur, and you take that dog and you put it in a warm climate, it will not be able to adjust. It'll keep that fur. Hope I've made that clear. In other words, the genes to do all that stuff are there in the general dog who can, he's got the potential to go various ways, and the ones who have the right traits will proliferate, and the ones that don't will die off and not do well or have to migrate somewhere else. In other words, genes are limited. Once you get certain gene sequences, there's only a certain amount of adaptability. But even building in adaptability, doesn't that tell you intelligent design? It does, doesn't it? But it has limits. Anyway, getting back to what he said here. Who brings out their host by number? Who calls them all by name? By the greatness of his might and strength, of his power, not one is missing. And God is awesome, and he cannot be pictured by our physical creativity. And idolatry blocked Israel from at least a reasonable level of worshiping the true God. And Jeroboam was worried about losing power when God gave him the northern 10, because he said Israel and Judah had one religion, and it was centered in Jerusalem at the temple. And he said, well, wait a minute. If our people keep going several times a year to Jerusalem, whether under the influence of my now new rival, I could lose control. And I don't want that. And by the way, in the ancient world, most rulers, most city-states, countries, empires, had their own god or their version of a god, and the emperors controlled the priests, and it was all part of a power thing. Even when America had American Revolution, the King of England was a titular head of the Church of England. So you can see how that all worked. Until the Americans came up with freedom of religion, the first country to do that, that was pretty much common. So Jeroboam said, wait a minute. I don't worry about losing these 10 tribes. So he talked to his advisors. We're going to go to 1 Kings 12:28. Here's what he and his advisors decided to do. 1 Kings 12:28. Therefore the king asked advice. Then they made 2 calves of gold and said to the people, it is too much for you to go all the way up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods who brought you out of Egypt. And set one in Bethel and one in Dan. So he got more convenient locations. One was actually only 10 miles north of Jerusalem, but it's on the road to Jerusalem to block his people from going down there. You can stay here and worship. He was doing things the human way, because that's what he thought was the best. And just going to 12:32 and 12:33, Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 15th day of the 8th month, not the 7th month, the 8th month, like the feast in Jerusalem. And I use that word, it was a counterfeit feast. Counterfeit feast. So he did at Bethel, sacrificing to the calves. And at Bethel he installed the priest of the high places which he had made. So he made an offering on the altar that he had made based on the 15th day, which he devised in his own heart. Notice, he did not get it from God. You can't make something holy. Only God can do that. And he ordained a feast for the children of Israel. And he offered sacrifice. He was the high priest. He did it all. I'm high priest and king. He did it. In other words, he said, I can keep my power the human way by just changing the religion and controlling the religion. Instead of trusting God, he did it the human way. Even though God told him, I've given you the 10 kings. This is a story. Rolls Royce is the name of the story. Like all these stories, it kind of makes a point, sort of. And this is a true story. Sometimes it does take a rocket scientist. Anyway, Rolls-Royce in Britain had built this gun, and they could fire chickens at windshields that they were building for jet liners and big bombers, because they can run into birds, going 400 or 500 miles an hour. They don't want the windshield to break. So they get to test them, make them strong enough. So, they sold the whole thing. And the American manufacturer, we want that gun to do testing on your windshields as well. So the Americans got the gun, and they tested it, and with a chicken. Well, not only did the chicken smash the windshield of the jet, it broke through and smashed the seat rest of the pilot and embedded itself in the back of the whole pilot's compartment. The American engineers were shocked. What? The windshield is that weak? So they wrote to the Rolls-Royce in Britain, what did we do wrong? We got any suggestions? And one of the rocket scientists responded with, defrost the chicken first. Americans love convenience. Let's take a frozen chicken, put it in the cannon. Well, that was Jeroboam. he did it the human way. And he got more power for himself. So how did God feel about all this? How did God feel? 1 Kings 15:30. Actually, God's criticism of Jeroboam's counterfeit religion is in the Bible, I think it's 25 times. That's, for the Bible, that's a whole lot of criticism. But we'll just read a few of them. Verse 30, because of the sins of Jeroboam, that is creating the counterfeit religion, which he had sinned and by which he made Israel sin. In other words, it was bad for the country. Because of his provocation, which he had provoked the Lord of Israel to anger. And it blocked people from having the kind of relationship with God that would have been a lot better for them. 1 Kings 20, verse 30. 1 Kings 12, verse 30. 1 Kings 12, verse 30. 12:30. And this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one, and even unto Dan. And he made a house of high places, which also God didn't like, and made the priest of the lowest of the people, which were not the sons of Levi. So in effect, what he did was take the Bible away from the northern people of the northern 10 tribes. Because printing didn't exist in those days, so Bibles and scrolls were very expensive to make, and only a few were out there. So basically, the Levites were taught by other Levites who read the scrolls, God's laws and the first 5 books of the Bible and the things they needed to know, the laws and rules. So in effect, the Levites were like, if you want to use the term, spiritual lawyers and judges. They were, and they did some other things related to that, health inspector. They were walking Bibles. So if you were the king, Jeroboam, and you wanted to change the truth, and you said to yourself, well, what could get in my way? People who know the Bible, who know, for instance, that Exodus 32 says making a golden calf was a disaster. God really came down hard on the Israelites for that. Bad. Well, but when you get rid of the Levites, you get rid of the people that know the truth. You get rid of the Bible. The men he picked either didn't know Exodus 32 about the golden calf, or they could care less. Maybe both. They didn't know and they could care less even if somebody mentioned it to them. They were, in those days, being a priest, you got to wear this beautiful robe, and I'm sure they got paid a reasonable salary. That was a good gig. They did it for the money. They would preach anything he told them to preach for the money. There's even a book I read that claimed that Margaret Sanger got certain ministers to speak up for abortion, because back then it was very unpopular, especially with Christians, to help her push the movement, and she bribed them with money. If that's true, oh well. You get the point, though. Isaiah 30, verse 10 to 11. Now, this scripture applies to all false prophets in Israel's history, but there's a certain point I want to make. Isaiah 30, 10 to 11. And maybe may have been self-deceived too. They may not have realized they were false prophets, maybe some of them. Isaiah 30:10, who say to the seers, because that's what a prophet is, he sees the future and God's will, do not see, and to the prophet, do not prophesy to us right things. Speak to us smooth things, something we want to hear. We want to hear that it's okay to be like the rest of the world. Prophesy deceits. Get out of the way. Turn aside from the path. Cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us. In other words, we want you false prophets to block stuff from the true God that we don't want to hear, that we don't want to see. And that's what they did. They blocked the pathway to understand God better for the people. 1 Corinthians 10:14. 1 Corinthians 10:14. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. And now, Paul really emphasizes it in 1 Corinthians 10. Flee idolatry. And he really emphasizes it. By the way, excessive covetousness, the Bible says, can also be idolatry. let's look at idolatry in the modern world. What kind of threat do we face? Unless you're in a certain church or two that does a lot of these statues and magic coins and the kind of things, you don't have to worry about little trinket gods that you carry around to remind you of the God in the sky. But in the modern world, we can get obsessed with things. And anything that becomes more important to us than God is an idol. So let's look at some of the modern day idols. And obviously I'm speculating on things that I've read, and there may be more, but just some things to think about it. One writer said maybe the number one thing could be your own self-image. Your own self-image. What God wants us to do is worship him in spirit and truth, led by faith, not worship him based on physical things we see. Now, I saw this TV commercial. Some of you might remember. There was this man. He wasn't really all that handsome, but I guess he was reasonably handsome. I don't particularly like male models, but I guess what you like. But he was reasonably handsome. But he had a great set of muscles. The great six-pack and chest and arms. And he was looking at himself in a mirror, and he was bragging about, I couldn't help looking at myself, looking at people, looking at me, looking at all the women, looking at me. Some of you might remember the commercial if you've ever seen it. He made an idol of himself. Now, if you spend many, many hours in the gym and you're taking steroids and all kind of other boosters and stuff, I got a cousin. Anyway, I'm going to that. And you spend your time building your body, and so you even in cold Thanksgiving days, he'd wear this little thing where his arms were out to show all his biceps. It was kind of funny. Anyway, but some of you know what I mean. You can make an idol of your own self-image and spend time admiring yourself in the mirror. And there may be varieties of that I haven't thought of, but you get the idea. Maybe the number two thing could be money and materialism. We're in a materialistic world, and you want to brag about the money you have and look at this car I've got. I was watching this car go by, and it had these hubcaps that sometimes they spun, and then they spun in opposite ways. And it was making the car stand out like, man, look at that car. Look at those silver hubcaps. And I assume it was some gangster, well, maybe it wasn't a gangster, but anyway, trying to show off how fabulous he was by the car. And the way that some of you might have seen hubcaps like that. You know what I mean. I'm not saying it's wrong to have a nice car, nice stuff. But if you love that sort of thing more than you love God, you're making an idol of it. And you can polish it and get mad if anybody. I saw this morning. He parks his car in the back of the parking lot so nobody can ever scratch it. It looks so beautiful. It shines and whatever. Third could be entertainment, which could be trips and fun, and you spend a lot of money. By the way, I think that's why drugs are cursed for some people. Fun, entertainment is their heart of their life. Well, you go to these parties. I haven't done all this because I've lived probably a boring life compared to some people. But you get the impression they go to these nightclubs and parties, and somebody said, man, you want to have more fun? You ought to take this drug called ecstasy. And there are a whole class of drugs, and I think China and a lot of the world is funneling drugs, they claim, to American cities, big time money they're making. And you take the drug and you get a high, you're having so much fun. Or they have fun with their movie stars, TV stars, and sports stars. And there's industries where people spend hours and hours reading about their movie stars, TV stars, and sports stars. I'm not saying it's wrong to read some of it, but if that is the biggest thing in your life, and all you want to do is look at the Kardashians, I guess they're the biggest thing on reality TV. I don't really know that. I get the impression from what people say they are. Maybe that's not true, but maybe it is. But that is your life. Entertainment. 4 is sex. If your life is controlled by pursuit of sex, and let's face it, that's a powerful force. There's nothing, no one can deny it. Anyway, the less I say about that, probably the better. Keep myself out of trouble. But you got to see the danger of that. Also, I have the feeling, I don't know if you can prove it statistically, but single men who spend all their time pursuing that sort of thing die younger than married men. I believe there are stats to back it up. I know there are other factors involved, but what seems like fun may have negative side effects and aren't so obvious. Number 5, smartphones. You're going to say, how can a stupid smartphone be an idol? I'm telling you what I've read. There are, especially people under 35, if you take their smartphone away, they go berserk. Like if the parents say to this 17-year-old girl, I don't like what you've been doing on social media, I'm taking your smartphone. She will go into withdrawal syndromes. I mean, literally, I read it, withdrawal, like a drug. You can't take it. It's unfair. It's un-American to take my phone. Ah! Literally. And so someone asked, well, how do you know if you're maybe putting something in front of God? Well, if you get really mad and upset when it's not available, you have your own version of withdrawal symptoms. And if you find any of those things are true, and over time, I think the world sucks you into different things, whatever thing that you might be more likely for. And even gossip magazines about movie stars can be part of that whole syndrome of thinking more about that than you do about God. If you think you're being sucked into things, pull you away from making God number one. Remember, God should be number one. And actually, that's even over family, patriotism, all the things you love like money. God should be number one. If you think these things are drawing you away, repent and spend more time with God.